delay.
There's a
Anyway.
delay when it shows up, but it's this audio, hello everybody, will show up on Facebook in like 10 seconds, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, we're figuring all that out, people. Hi, everybody. We are here for a live recording of Judaism Unbound. I'm Dan Levinson. This is Lex Rofberg. We'll introduce ourselves more formally in a second. Just to note for folks who, are legions of people out there who are just like waiting by the computer to see when the Judaism Unbound live recording starts. We are not
Yes, millions.
usually when we do a live show on Jewish Live, we actually start the show at the hour. With our Judaism Unbound live episodes, we tend to start a little after the hour because when we have a guest, we have them come on usually at the hour just for convenience sake, and we do a little bit of prep, and then we get started, about 10 minutes or so thereafter. And that's the same with Lex and me, especially here. It's a Monday morning first thing. And so it's easier to just come on at the hour and do a little bit of prep and then get going. So for those of you who are out there and concerned about why we're starting late, I guess I'll say for now on, this is not late. This is when it starts, approximately 10 after. Okay, so we are going to start in our formal way, and we hope you enjoy. This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound, Realism and Hope. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are doing another one of these midweek bonus episodes of Judaism Unbound, where we are doing something that you could call futurism. This is where Lex and I are just going to be talking about what we're seeing happening today and where we think it leads in the future. We've had some demand from listeners that would be a very valuable thing, and we think it would be fun to do and important to do, at least important for us to think this stuff through. And so we're glad to share it. And that's what these episodes are about. So Lex, I want to start with two things, really. One is to talk about the New York Times Daily podcast that I listened to this morning. And just for folks to know, we're recording on Monday, April 20th. And so if you want to go back and listen to the Daily episode from April 20th, that would probably be valuable. I mean, I think it's valuable for everyone, but I think it's also informing a little bit of where I'm coming from this morning, having just listened to that. But before I talk about the episode,
non-live viewers, check it out in the show notes.
Right. And before I jump into what that talked about, I want to bring back an idea that I think we've talked about a number of times on Judaism Unbound in the past, which is the concept from the book Good to Great by Jim Collins that he calls the Stockdale paradox. And he describes this as coming from conversations that he had with Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was the commanding officer, the highest ranking officer in the Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp during the Vietnam War. And he talked about who survived the prisoner of war camps. And Stockdale said that it was the people, neither the optimists nor the pessimists survived, right? The people who felt, the optimists who said this is going to be over by Christmas and this is going to be over by Easter, those were the people who eventually got so depressed that it still wasn't over, that they died, he says, of a broken heart. And the people who were pessimists, who said, we're never going to go home again, those were the people who also died early on because they had basically nothing to live for. The people who survived were the people who were realists combined with hopeful, meaning that they said this might go on for a very long time, years, and it's going to be a miserable experience. And Collins says it's the people who confronted the brutal facts of the present reality without flinching, without lying to themselves or to others and saying it's other than it really is likely to be. And at the same time, they never lost hope that they would prevail in the end. And that ultimately they would go home, ultimately their life would go back to normal. And as Stockdale says, maybe this would be the defining feature of their life. They would actually build a life that they could only build because of having gone through the crucible of these prisoner of war camps. And Viktor Frankl says something very similar about the Holocaust and those who survived the concentration camps. Of course, many didn't survive because they were killed by the Nazis, but those who died for other reasons, Viktor Frankl had very similar ideas about who survived that experience. And so that's number one. And I feel like I don't know exactly what's going on in the world of Jewish organizations. I think that's part of the issue right now. It's not clear where the communication channels are. So I'm not totally sure how this is being handled by Jewish organizations per se, but I certainly see how this is being handled by our government, and the federal government in particular. And there seems to be this unwillingness to tell people that this is going to be a very, very long situation. And so Donald Trump is up there constantly saying, we're about to reopen the country, we want to reopen the country. And I think that's giving people a false hope that eventually is going to be dashed, and with all kinds of negative consequences. I'm concerned a little bit that that's happening in the Jewish community as well. And I want today's conversation to focus on not the question of whether we have false hope or don't have false hope, but the question of assuming that we are actually going to confront the brutal facts of reality, and to have realism combined with hope. What should we be thinking about? And today on the daily podcast, the New York Times podcast, their pandemic reporter basically said a couple of things that were pretty sobering. One was that the fastest in human history that a new vaccine has ever been developed is 4 years. And I think that should let it sink in for us, because what we've been hearing is 12 to 18 months. And it sounds to me like what he's saying is that 12 to 18 months is the best case scenario when we're dealing with a vaccine that's a variant of something that we already have. And maybe this will end up being that. But if it's something new, like I think the mumps vaccine was the one that he said was the fastest ever developed, and it took 4 years. That's something that we potentially have to be thinking about. Now, I've also been hearing from various people talking about various other arms of society on the news and elsewhere that there's talk that of 2021, 2022, that really this may be a situation that lasts much longer than any of us has been thinking about in a very active way. We've been saying, well, maybe we'll go back in the summer, maybe in the fall, maybe at the latest by December, January. And what if it takes much longer than that? And it feels like at least we need to be planning for that as a contingency. Now, just to give one dramatic example of that actually is not so dramatic when you're talking on the scale of it could be as much as 4 years, or that's the soonest a vaccine was ever created, that means that high holiday services this fall will not happen in the synagogues. And let that sink in. You know, that is, what if we started to plan? And I mean, this isn't our biggest concern necessarily as Judaism Unbound, whether or not the high holiday services will happen. But for those out there who are concerned about things like that, what if we said right now that that camp is not happening, the high holiday services are not happening, the fall semester is not happening. So now let's start to talk about, I'm not trying to be a downer. I'm trying to do what Admiral Jim Stockdale or Viktor Frankl said, and to confront the brutal facts of reality, and to say, if that's the situation that we're starting from, where does that lead us? So Lex, this leads me to your idea. And I want to spend today largely focused on two ideas that you've really put out there in the world in prominent ways. One is that we could analogize, and this was before the coronavirus, that we could analogize what's happening in terms of digital Judaism to the idea that the Jews are migrating from one land to a new land. And so imagine that the coronavirus is playing the role here of the Cossacks, that there's a pogrom, that there are these terrible pogroms that are happening, and they're causing us to have to leave for a different land. And so here the Cossack is the coronavirus, and we are leaving for a different land, which is this digital realm, this realm in which our bodies are in our homes. And we have to figure out how to be Jewish in this new land. And the other idea that you've put out there is to imagine that the Jews arrive on a new planet en masse. And there are 13 million Jews on this new planet, and there's literally nothing else there. And the question is, what would we build if that was the situation? And we couldn't take our institutions with us. They don't fit on the spaceship. So the question is, what would we build if we were starting from scratch? And I think that those analogies are really actually pretty apt for this time. And I think it would be a valuable thing to start to play out. Let's take that really seriously. So I guess I'd start by asking you, when you put that out there, you do it and you ask the audience to start talking that way. I'd like to ask you, like, if you start to think about that new land, what does it start to look like for you?
Don't tell people my secret about presenting, which is that I mostly just ask questions and everybody else says the things. That's my secret.
Right.
Yeah. So before I want to quick just say I know you didn't say the same, but I just want to underscore so that there's not a possible misinterpretation. We're not saying that people who die now due to coronavirus or who die, like, we're not saying that they were like deemed to die based on their outlook. We are saying that there could be I mean, I'm really interested in the Stockdale paradox and the analysis there. But I just
Oh
want to
yeah,
make it crystal clear that, like,
yes.
I know you didn't say that, Dave, but I'm just, in case anybody heard that in a different way. Okay, so starting there. Okay, so the two ideas you mentioned, migration and new planet. Okay, so I'll start with the migration piece, because what I always say here is that I do think very strongly that digital Judaism has already been a migration before long before coronavirus. The last few decades have already started a kind of migration. Now, I always clarify for people that this is an interesting and new kind of migration, because all of the migrations that we've done before, you start in one location and you end in another. You don't stay in the first location at all. So if you're migrating from Europe to the United States, you pack your bags and you leave, and you are no longer in Europe. This migration is like, we don't have the right word for it. Migration to me is the closest. It's different because we're actually, like, in going to digital Jewish spaces. I do think they're spaces. That's why I think migration works as a term. But in going to digital Jewish communities, we actually don't have to entirely leave behind our other kinds of communities that are offline. Now, what's interesting right now is that we do. Like, what's interesting
Right.
under coronavirus is we do. So all of a sudden, the hazy, not quite migration, not sure what the right term is, has become kind of more traditionally a migration. Like, all of the synagogues in Providence, Rhode Island, where I live, are not operating on the ground. All of the JCC, like, all of those organizations are not operating in the same way on the ground. Now, they're still functioning digitally. And so each one has kind of done its own migration. But I just want to name that because I think it's important to recognize that this is not a migration that is only right now out of necessity. It's one that lots and lots and lots of people were doing beforehand. Now, the planet thing. I have talked about it as a planet. So you've got 13 million Jews. That's approximately the number that people guess there are on Earth. Although there's really not good data on how many Jews there are anywhere other than the U.S. and Israel. That's where we know most of. But let's say there are 13 million Jews thereabouts. It's interesting. I don't think I've used the planet terminology. I think I've talked about, imagine there was a community or a city where there were 13 million Jews. What would you create in that city? And for me, the distinction is important because a planet implies like a huge, like, you would set up micro separate communities. Like, the reality is all of us are in the same space. Like, somebody in South Africa and somebody in Australia and somebody in Japan and somebody in Uganda and somebody in America, if we're accessing digitally, and I don't mean to say that every community in every country around the world has equal access to the internet, but more and more communities do on some level. We're actually not in separate corners so much. We create separate corners of the digital Jewish world,
Well,
but
as a science fiction fan, I guess I'll just say that I was imagining that the planet, like, when you first colonize a planet, everybody's under one, big dome.
yeah, I mean, that's my other nerve about the planet thing, is that it does sound colonialist. Like, I like you just you use the word colonized. Like, I look, I don't I still want to use this metaphor, but like, for me, it's even more nuts than if we're all settling a new planet. We're all like, imagine your local community at its current geographic size, and just there's 13 million Jews there now. Like, that's what this is. We are all like, if I wanted to, could go on to, whether it's Facebook or other places where there just are a lot of people at any given moment, and I could start a Facebook audio, like I could start a phone call, I could start a video chat, like I could talk to like a random assortment of people all around the world in the way that I could walk into a community center and talk to random people. Now, in the community center or online, would people be weirded out if I just walked out to them randomly? Sure. But we are gathered in the same space. So I've been rambling, but what I ask is non-trivial. Like, okay, we actually do get to start from scratch in a sense. We're not entirely scratch, but like everything that exists in the digital Jewish ecosystem is at most, I don't know, 25, 30 years. The earliest chat rooms or whatever, maybe 30, 35 years old. But like we've got a blank slate, and we get to do the game that, you know, people play with their organizations. Like, if we were starting over tomorrow, what would we do? What wouldn't we do? Like we get to do that. Like that's right. We're here. So my intuition is one thing we would do is we would replicate certain of the things that we're doing in institutions and out of institutions offline. But I think we'd actually construct way fewer of everything than we currently have. Right now, every on the ground institution has created their own digital slate of programming. And like, that's so much work. Like if we were to look at the number of hours that professional staff and lay leaders are putting in to constructing Jewish programming right now online, it is so much. It is, I'm certain it's thousands of hours a day that people are putting into this if you really were to find everybody and add it up. And it doesn't make any sense. Like we've got every community creating a Friday night service option online. We've got every community, and once again, we're all in the same community. If I'm in Providence, Rhode Island, like even if there were 13 million Jews here, we wouldn't make 300 different synagogues in a 3-mile radius. Like that wouldn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. We would recognize that there is a certain amount of need, and going beyond that is just a waste of time and resources. And I feel like we're doing that, and we're not looking to share. Communities aren't thinking, so there's, I'm going to make up let's say there's like 100 synagogues in Massachusetts or 300 synagogues in California. I don't know any of these numbers, but like they could very easily all come together and say, okay, we've got some network of our rabbis or of our, we could make a system where a few communities step up every week and create services. We make sure to have a reform option, we make sure to have a conservative, we make sure to have one that's more interactive, one that's more like watching, whatever. You could have 4 or 5. Everybody could go, make sure you have the biggest level of the various Zoom rooms, you all split the cost, whatever. And then everybody else could spend their time doing what's really important right now, which is counsel, like pastoral work and like learning programming, whatever. Like as it is, hundreds upon hundreds of synagogues are planning services in the same community because this is one space.
The same community, meaning the digital community.
Yeah, we are all there. And we've got, look, go to our website and check out it's beautiful on one level, right? Like we've got this calendar on our website with all of the different Friday night options. And there's another one for Saturday morning. And like, it's cool, but I kind of want to say to some of these places, like, look, if what you're doing is a service, we don't need 150. I'm not going to say we need 1, but we might need 5 or maybe even 10.
Let me ask you though, so what you're describing, I agree with your fundamental description. The question is realistically, we're talking realism on multiple levels, I guess. Yeah. I was talking the realism to understand that this is going to be a long-term process. The other realism is like the way change happens, unfortunately, right? It's not that like within a few weeks or a few months, like all of a sudden the people are conducting themselves in new ways, right? There are all kinds of reasons why this is happening, right? Which is that naturally every institution wants to survive. Yeah. And if you all of a sudden stop doing your own programming, but you had been defined previously by the programming that you did, then what is the continuing reason for your existence? So nobody wants to say, oh, there's no more reason for our existence, we should just fold up shop. Yeah. I wouldn't want to say that for us.
But that's what I'm getting. I don't think there's no reason for these communities' existence. I actually, like, what's clear to me, like when I talk to people that are setting up some of these services or attending them, a few things come up. One is one that you've said that is not new to you and not new to our listeners. Like, services are not about services. Like these communities that are having a Friday night service, they know that there's 150, like they're not doing it because the world needs their conservative or reform or reconstructionist kind of service. They know that there are other services that might not be identical, but that are similar. But this is a service for their community's people to see each other and be in community with each other and to feel like I still have these people. And so, first off, that's a need of specific people that are part of that community. It's not a need of like Jews writ large, but it is a real need. And what that tells me is, okay, if that's the reason, and I do think that's a compelling reason to have a gathering of 20 or 60 or 110 people. Now, if that's the reason, let's be honest about it. The reason we are coming together for a service is not the service. We might still want to do some kind of service to feel like that's there, but like what that means is people's primary need in this moment is a sense of connection to people they recognize and who they share a space with. So if that's the case, then let's create what the small community should be doing is not, okay, I'm going to plan out my 55-minute digital service with one person singing into the mic and everybody else on mute. And what it should be is, okay, we're going to have a mini service. By the way, I don't want to speak for everybody. Like to me, this would be a common good model. We're going to have a mini service. Some of our greatest hits, the melodies that people hear and think, yeah, that's my congregation's melody. Like the communities have that. And then set aside 40 minutes for breakout groups for people to schmooze with each other. Like if that's why people are there, to have a sense of, I see my friend who I see in the third row at services, or I talk to at the schmooze afterwards, like then let's do that. But what I find right now is we're replicating the program in quotes, like we're replicating the service when I don't think people are even. And then there's the question of whether people in normal times are going to the service for the service.
Well, right. So that's where I want to I mean, I think that your critiques are correct and that, but I don't want to only spend our time like critiquing what people are currently doing, because I think that there's also, let's put out sort of what does the alternative look like, right? And I don't mean the alternative of like what people should do last week or next week. I mean the alternative like in 6 months from now, when people's heads clear, right? When they sort of are thinking, when some of the thoughts are not there anymore that are currently animating some of this. Like I think that look, if you thought that this was going to be a month or two situation and then everything was going to go back to normal, then I think you could make the argument that what everybody's doing right now is reasonable. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I was trying to say in terms of leading with the more pessimistic, but in the realm of realism, read on things. Because at the very least, that other view should be equally important in our strategic thinking, because we don't know which it's going to be. Now I'm starting to say that I'm thinking that as I'm hearing things, it's starting to look like it's the more pessimistic version. And so to me, it's like, and by pessimistic, I mean the one that says it's going to be a year, it's going to be maybe even more than a year. So how do we start thinking about what the world looks like in that? And how do we think about that in a not negative way? How do we think about that in a constructive way? So at the point at which you're, what we're talking about that, then that's why I want to go back to this question of what if we were founding the new, whatever you want to call it, planet, city, whatever it might be, what would we do rather than what we shouldn't do, right? And so I'm thinking like, what, and also we should be talking about other than the realm of Shabbat services or whatever, like what are the institutions or organizations or not organizations, individual things that facilitate individual practice, like we were talking about last week? What are the things that kind of we need more of? And right, I mean, like one of the topics, for example, that we could say, like, look, it's really too bad that Bimbom is gone, because one of the things that we would create if we were coming into a time like this and we knew it was going to last years would be some kind of children's center, right? Some kind of children's Jewish learning, Jewish experience. Kids are sitting there on their screens all day. What if there was something really compelling for them to do Jewishly? And like you say, we wouldn't need to, I mean, the difference is that we already have questions like that. we're already saying like, oh, we want kids to have better Jewish experiences, but the difference is that in this new city, this new world that we're creating, we might only need to create one or two, as opposed to the old world, which was some of the questions were like, let's say that you create, so we talked to Rebecca Milder some weeks ago during our education series, and she's doing what I believe, and I'm biased because my child goes to it, but she's creating an unbelievable after-school Jewish experience. And you could say, well, okay, so what? Because that's in some small part of Chicago. And for that philosophy to really take on, and take off, you would have to find a way, a funding model that allows Rebecca to replicate her center in, dozens, if not hundreds of communities around the country in order to really transform the Jewish education experience of kids. Now, you might say, Rebecca, how can we partner with you to help you build one digital version of what you're doing that potentially could be way cheaper and reach the same number of kids? So it's an extraordinary opportunity for Jewish education, I would say, for example. Now, I think that's what we're trying to do in terms of what you could call adult Jewish education. We're saying, can we create a platform? I'm starting to think of it as a version of Jewish masterclass. There's this masterclass is this company that gets the like really famous people that are really the top of their craft to teach a class in how to do what they do. And there are all kinds of ways in which what we're doing is not like that. But I mean, there are certain ways in where we're saying is that, like, could we create a central place where some of the greatest Jewish teachers and greatest Jewish thinkers are all there together, sharing their ideas with people in compelling ways, so that people don't have to know 42,000 different places to go. They could just say, oh, let me go see what's new on Jewish Live this week. And so that's where I kind of think like those are just two examples of I think what I think this new city potentially would suggest.
Yeah. So okay, on the learning front, I appreciate what you said, which is that we shouldn't just talk about what is like what's not going right now. What I actually think that the way that learning is going from my perspective, and I'm seeing what we do, and I'm seeing some of the other bigger things. So I don't really know every Jewish learning creation that's happening right now around the country, but the sense I get is like synagogues and local communities that do learning, I do think they're saying, oh, now we're digital and there's incredible teachers out there that are doing regular offerings. I don't need to do as much on that front as I normally have. Now, once again, I don't know that for sure, but the sense I get is communities that have Torah studies, communities that have regular learning sessions, not all of them there's not a sense that they all have to continue at the same frequency. There's a big push. I've seen lots of congregational newsletters and otherwise saying like, go to these other places online that are offering great stuff that aren't us, because we're going to focus on this other realm of things. I agree with you that it's not just about services, but the reason I brought up services is because I do think that for whatever reason, there is this real sense that if we're a real thing, if we're a congregation, if we're like, we have to have a service, period. We might not need to have, if we don't have Jewish learning, like, okay, if we don't have the social stuff that we sometimes do, our sisterhoods and whatever other stuff, like, that's okay. We're still like, if we don't have a service, then we're not a thing anymore. And like, oh my gosh. And I think that's not true. I think that that communities are more than that. But B, I think it's destructive because it centers services in a way that is exactly what you don't want us to do. So let's go to the other realm that like learning, I actually feel pretty good about. I think that we do have some of the masterclass type orientation happening where there's people sort of rising and like, they've got their name that's previously been known around the country, and so they're offering something, and new people are finding that because they're not going to the local offerings that they have been. Cool, great. What I'm not seeing, let's talk about community centers, like actual Jewish community centers for a second. That we're like, and once again, this may exist and maybe I just don't know about it. I have not seen anybody look to migrate the parts of Jewish communities that are less sort of in quotes, Jewish content, and more like, okay, this is a Jewish community center with 50% of people who come into this building are not even Jews. And we have, a basketball league. We have like, obviously you can't have a basketball league in the same way, but like if we wanted to replicate some of the just, social gathering things in Jewish buildings, etc., we could. And we're not, and I haven't seen as much of that. So I'm curious, like if we were starting that 13 million person community, we would certainly want to create spaces and opportunities for people to connect with other Jews and to connect Jewishly in ways that aren't just, Torah and services. And I feel like what we've done a good job of thus far are sort of the more obviously directly Jewish feeling things, and less, what might happen at a typical JCC when you look at their full schedule of programming in the gym and in the various, spaces where people are interacting around all sorts of stuff that is not necessarily learning or prayer.
Okay, but so this raises, though, the classic innovator's dilemma question. And this is why I want to try to stay away from criticism, by which I don't mean like being critical in a bad way. I just mean about sort of evaluation of what people are or not doing in terms of what existing organizations are doing. And I want to raise this question again of what should someone do? Because it doesn't matter who the someone is necessarily in the new city, in the new land, right? And it may be that it's actually, for reasons of theory, of the innovator's dilemma, disruptive innovation, it may be precisely not the people who are doing that activity before who are best positioned to do it after. And that's because so much of their business model is caught up in a previous iteration that it just doesn't make sense on all kinds of levels. I mean, like I really feel for the JCC world right now, because their entire business model is based on, first of all, that a lot of non-Jews are participating. Second of all, specifically what they're participating in is not usually the Jewish content piece, but things like the gym and the basketball league and the Pilates and yoga and whatever. And those things are fundamentally subsidizing whatever Jewish content the JCC has been able to provide. That's the business model. Mm-hmm. So when all of a sudden, all of those sources of revenue go away suddenly, first of all, you've got a huge facility, a huge physical plant, and a huge staff of people whose jobs no longer make sense in this period. Again, if you're thinking that it's a short-term situation, then you say, how can we keep these folks on the payroll for a month or two, and then maybe things will go back? But if we're starting to say, well, things are not going back, I mean, even if some of what we're experiencing relaxes, like we're still not going to have mass gatherings. We're still not going to have gyms or yoga studios with that kind of crowdedness. Mm-hmm. Then those business models are gone for years. And so I really feel for the people leading those institutions to say, like, this is really hard. And it's not clear that your institution can pivot that way and still kind of make anywhere near the amount of revenue that you've been making before. And if you're not able to bring in anywhere near the amount of revenue that you're making before, then you're functionally a different institution anyway. Mm-hmm. And so the question is kind of like, okay, so whether it's an existing JCC that figures it out or some new JCC, by the way, like I really have been saying for years that we need to have a JCC, right? That if the internet is a new land, then we should have a JCC for that new land. And so the question is kind of what would a JCC of the internet look like? And it wouldn't have a gym, because there are no gyms on the internet. Now, maybe at some point with virtual reality, there will be, but right now that doesn't make any sense. So the JCC of the internet would maybe we'd be thinking about the Jewish content piece. And I've been thinking about Jewish Live as potentially a version of a JCC of the internet. So mm-hmm. in the case that we're talking about in terms of a JCC, what we're seeing, at least in the case of Jewish Live, is who created a JCC of the internet? A couple of podcasters. Why? Mm-hmm. Because we kind of were living on the internet and so, okay, well, let's do, like, we want to have more content. We're already in the content business. And so in a sense, what we have is a bunch of Zoom rooms. I mean, I really think it's interesting to think about like what we're doing as a JCC of the internet, because we have a bunch of rooms. They're rooms on Zoom. We pay for them a lot less than a JCC pays for its mortgage payments. if we need more rooms, we can pay an extra basically $20 a month to Zoom to get another room. If we find ourselves that we don't have as much programming as we thought, we can pay $20 a month less to Zoom, right? We're utterly flexible. Unlike JCC that has to build a physical plant and sort of decide at one point in the past what the future is going to look like. And if they miscalculate, then it's problematic in either direction, right? We're at least currently not tied to any other, business model that is, under these vicissitudes. But the whole point is that we were able to do that because we were starting basically with nothing.
Yeah.
And it's ironic, but that's the innovator's dilemma, that sometimes the people starting with nothing, i.e. a startup, is in the best position to do something than the most powerful organization that exists in the current economy.
Yeah. So this is great. And I want to keep going with the okay, Zoom rooms, literal rooms, JCC. I think a useful moment of some of these bonus podcasts is when we can zoom in, haha, pun, on specific things that are happening digitally and specific features. We talked a little last week about the difference between a Facebook Live service and a Zoom service. I want to zoom in on what you just said, which is we have different rooms. Not only do we have different rooms, I would argue it's the equivalent of if a JCC, and some JCCs have this, others don't, but a JCC that has a theater and a classroom or many classrooms. Let's talk about the webinar function and the meeting function of Zoom for a second, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there and they're interesting to me, what they reflect. So webinar formats in Zoom, I think, are comparable to a theater. Nobody would go to an event in a 250 person theater with, let's say it's a panel discussion. There's 3 people on the stage and you're nobody would go to that and say afterwards, that was great, but I didn't get to see everybody in the room. That's a weird, that would be a weird response, right? But all the time when there's Zoom webinars, people go and they're that was I learned a lot, but I was bummed that I couldn't see everybody. And to me, it's what we have to realize is there's different, there's different expectations for different kinds of events and different kinds of models. So a webinar is not it's not an interactive event in the same way. Now, I think we should be doing a lot of interactive events, but it's like you're going to a movie theater or you're going to a production of a play. Maybe there's a Q&A afterwards and maybe you get to ask a question, but it's just a different kind of thing. Now, a meeting is like a classroom. And I think that it would be a fair criticism if you go to a round table, like a 20-person round table discussion where everybody's supposed to be interacting, whether it's Torah study or otherwise, and only a couple people talk the whole time. So I that's a micro example. We don't need to go into all of that. But the reason I bring it up is because we are figuring out what that migration means. And I think we need to continually push ourselves to say, okay, the X and Y seem roughly the same in this new place. How are they different? Webinar and meeting. What is different about them, and how would that difference make maybe mean a lot for how we set up a meaningful, engaging program or service or learning? How do we do in-depth learning about this new space? If we were going to a new country, without getting into assimilation discourse, we would want to learn the language of that country. We would want to, or the multiple languages, we would want to be able to navigate that city. We would want to be able to have the basic tools to understand what the place is. And what I'm excited about is people are doing that. But I think we need to constantly be asking ourselves and pushing ourselves to take that next step, to learn what that next Zoom feature is, to play with breakout rooms, to play with share screen, to play with virtual backgrounds. Because on the one level, they feel cute, right? They feel little glitzy, whatever. But I honestly think it's comparable to I don't know, going to a JCC and knowing how to use the projector. If you don't know how to use the projector, then a whole slate of possible programs are gone. Right. So how do we get to that place? And how do we accelerate that process?
Right. I mean, the reason why I think that talking about a planet might make more sense than talking about a city in this particular situation is because like you were saying earlier, it is different from the ideas that we were floating around, a year ago or whatever, where we thought this could be a really interesting migration because it's only a partial migration, and we're able to live in both the physical world and the digital world at the same time. Whereas we might be looking at some number of months or years where we really can't live in the physical world at all from an institutional standpoint. Doesn't mean that we can't go out and have a walk and all those kind of things, but we can't have mass gatherings in person, for example. Well, that would very much challenge the models of many of our existing Jewish institutions. And so I think that to spin out what that might look like, or what we might need it to look like, becomes really important. And that's also where I would say about what you're saying. Yes, right now we have to learn how to use Zoom. That's a micro example, like you were saying. But right now, it's like when we arrive at the new planet, that there's a particular technology that the early folks who arrive put there, right? And we have to learn how to do that. Think of it as like if you are settling in the woods, for example, you learn to build a log cabin, because the materials that you have there are trees. But eventually they'll build railroads, and then there'll be new building materials that come. And so, yeah, you have to learn how to build a log cabin, but only for a little while. And then, some of these other pieces of knowledge will become important. So, like, for example, I'm thinking, like, if we were going to do futurism, it seems to me very likely, for example, that if this situation is such that this is going to be for years, then there's some companies out there currently driving very hard to get virtual reality onto the market very fast. And so we could learn to use Zoom right now, but it also feels worthy to start thinking about how we would use virtual reality if and when it becomes a ubiquitous technology, which might in the past have been 10 years from now, and now might be 1 year from now. I don't know. It might not be. There are a lot of things, like when I was growing up and watching the Jetsons, they were always video phones, and people were always like, oh, there's video phones are coming. And they didn't come for, a good 40 years, 50, the Jetsons was even, so, 50, 60, I don't know how many years it took for the video phones to actually exist. So maybe virtual reality isn't going to be it, but it seems something is going to be it, because I guarantee you that in a year from now, we're not going to be, if this is still the situation, we're not going to be here on Zoom in this kind of situation. So how do we become ready? How do we become ready for rapid change? And
I think we Talmud. I mean, this goes to what is it like to me? Like, that's so exciting, and it's like I picture the rabbis of the Talmud as basically, what is it, Hanna-Barbera, like the people who made the gesture. It's like they came up with a bunch of wild cases in every realm of the Talmud. So if you're in the section, and I talked about this with like the elephant as the wall of the sukkah, like if you're in the part about Sukkot, there's like all sorts of wild ideas for what could conceivably serve as the walls of a sukkah, and like where the sukkah could be located. And then it's not just the Talmud. Later and later, like there's stuff about, can a car be a sukkah? Can it this be like all of these things? And to me, that's not just a game. That's not just like, oh, we're having fun and like making up sci-fi or fantasy stories that make the Talmud more interesting as a sideline thing, so that we can get back to the real conversation about the rules of the sukkah. Like, no, that is actually the point. Like, the Jetsons did a service by opening our imaginations to video screens. They also imagine things that do not exist yet. Maybe they'll still exist, maybe they won't. But like, the fact that some of those things don't exist that's not like a knock on the Jetsons. It's like, okay, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to say, okay, if we have X capability, if I'm getting my Talmud voice, if we can have this virtual reality and simulate a basketball game, how would the JCC do that? Or how would the non-JCC that's new, like how would anybody do that? If picture everything that we can't do right now, like, what would we do if we could? Like, let's ask those questions. I agree with you that we should ask those now. And I'm almost thinking that we need, so maybe the Talmud's analogy, but maybe it's like Dayenu. Like, so Dayenu, the part of the Seder, of the Passover Seder, it starts with like, okay, and it's a lie, by the way. It says like, it would have been enough if God like brought us out of Egypt, but didn't bring us to the promised land. Like that wouldn't really have been enough in the story. There's all sorts of ways that like stuff wouldn't have been enough. And I think if we did that model digital, like it would be enough if we could see each other on a screen but couldn't talk. Well, that wouldn't be enough, but like we get the point. That's like one level of digital interaction. Now, it would have been enough if we could see each other and talk to each other, but we couldn't share screens. It would have been enough. Like if maybe we should do that. Like maybe we should make this progression of like all the possibilities, including some that we can't do yet. It would have been enough if we could hug each other through digital modalities. It would have been enough, like if we could play basketball, all that stuff. I think that could benefit us because you're right. Like some of these pieces are gonna come, and it forces us into a long-term mode of thinking and not this 1 or 2 month piece. So I'm hopeful that we can do some of that work.
Well, so I'm not sure that we've done today what we're saying folks need to do. So I think that maybe we should try to pick it up next week, where we really have this brainstorm almost. As I can see from this conversation, it's really, really, really hard to do, even for those who are kind of primed to do it, like we are. All the more so for people who have not been primed to do it because they haven't been thinking about it for literally years. And so again, I have like tremendous compassion for everybody because it's so hard, and yet it's so necessary. And so I think that we're going to have to, I think that we're going to have to try to do some real thinking here about what folks might actually try to do. And I think that maybe we're talking about two different kinds of people, right? One is people that are currently running existing institutions, whether they are large JCCs or small synagogues or anything in between, or even anything bigger. I mean, multiple umbrella type organizations as well. And how one might think, again, like I want to really hit hard on this analogy and say, what Russian institution, what Eastern European institution migrated from Eastern Europe to America 100 years ago? I think almost none, right? Meaning like it wasn't, whatever institutions were there, like they weren't the same on the other side of it. They didn't migrate. If this is really a migration, then that's gonna, then I think we should imagine a world in which none of the existing institutions that existed 2 months ago exist in 2 years from now. What would that world look like? It's a very frightening world on a lot of levels. It's a frightening world for people who say, but I work for one of those institutions, I'm going to lose my job. The answer is yes. Hopefully you'll have a job in the new land, just like the people who migrated, by definition, they lost their job in Poland. So that may be an unpleasant reality. And that brings us full circle to what I'm trying to say about the realism and hope. Let's at least play out the possibility that that is the case. And what would it look like in that scary future where we are literally rebuilding or building anew every single element of American Jewish life for the 21st century and beyond? And by the way, I want to make sure it's clear, it's not only digital. It's not like the new institutions that were built in America were only American in all kinds of ways. They were American, and they also had all these other elements to them. So I don't want to be misheard to say that we're imagining some matrix-like universe where the rest of Judaism is forevermore is digital and there's no physical contact. Of course, that's not the world that we're imagining. But nevertheless, that may be a transitional period for some number of years that will be the crucible through which that new Jewish world that goes back to also including physical contact, that gets formed through. It's sort of a funnel, sort of a rate determining step in the scientific jargon, and so I think that I want to challenge us, and I want to challenge everybody to think about that possibility. And I'd like to spend some time next week really trying to drill deep into that and to say, what would and again, I go back to what would a planet of 13 million Jews, plus, by the way, all the non-Jews or people who aren't Jewish, that are around them, or that, in the sort of one Mahia land, that get say, this is awesome what you guys are doing. You 13 million have figured out how to do something so cool. I want to be part of that, or I want to dabble in it and dabble out of it, right? I mean, what does that new world look like? And I think that it may be that the models that we currently have for what we currently are looking at aren't actually very relevant. So I would challenge us to go beyond even the mental models that we have of synagogues or JCCs, which themselves are, inventions of 20th century America. So, maybe that's just not a model that, or any of the other models, Hillel's, BBYO, the federations. These are all models that existed only in 20th century America. So maybe they're not the right models to use for this new land.
Yeah. So that's a good, it's a good, what's the word? Wow, I'm blanking. When it's the suspenseful moment at the end of the TV
cliffhanger.
show, cliffhanger. Thank you. Yikes. So that's a perfect cliffhanger for next week. I agree with you. We only started this now, and we're both doing our best to claw our way through some of these analogies and metaphors to get, and they're not just analogies and metaphors, but to get to the right language for what we're living through right now. But we will be back next week for another bonus Monday episode of Judaism Unbound Live, and we hope that you'll join us for that. We're going to close this episode out in the way that we always do, just by encouraging you to be in touch with us. If you have ideas, questions, frameworks, thoughts, any of it about the world we're in right now, Jewishly and otherwise, please, we really, we're gaining a lot from the people that are sending those ideas our way. So please continue to do that. You can do so via our Facebook pages. That's Jewish Live, all one word, or Judaism Unbound. You can also head to our Judaism Unbound Twitter handle, just at Judaism Unbound. You can go to our websites, JudaismUnbound.com or JewishLive.org. Jewish Live, once again, all one word. And last but not least, you can email us, Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply, deeply appreciate donations right now. It goes a huge, long way in helping us to just set up some of the, I don't know, the tachlis, the practical stuff, infrastructure of what this new Jewish world could be. And you can do so via jewishlive.org/donate or JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. We are definitely going to continue this thread of conversations going about what this planet or city or any of it of 13 million people inhabiting Judaism together digitally will be. But with that, this has been Judaism Unbound Live.